The sun was just beginning to set, casting long shadows across Maple Street. The neighborhood, usually calm and predictable, seemed oddly silent that evening. Emma stood at the edge of her driveway, her heart pounding in her chest. Tears welled up in her eyes as she glanced nervously down the street. Without warning, she turned and sprinted toward the curb, her sobs echoing in the quiet dusk. As she reached the end of the block, she threw herself into the arms of Mr. Jenkins, the local garbage man, who was finishing his nightly rounds. His kind eyes met hers with concern, but before he could ask what was wrong, the sound of sirens pierced the air. Within minutes, flashing lights bathed the street in blue and red. Police cars arrived swiftly, their presence turning the familiar neighborhood into a scene of urgency and tension. Officers began cordoning off the area, their radios crackling with messages. Emma stood frozen, her cries silenced by the unfolding chaos. Neighbors peeked from their windows, whispers spreading like wildfire. What had driven Emma to such desperation? Why was the street being shut down so suddenly? As the minutes ticked by, the mystery deepened. Rumors started circulating. Some spoke of a recent string of break-ins. Others hinted at something more sinister lurking in the shadows. Mr. Jenkins remained by Emma's side, trying to offer comfort amidst the confusion. The police moved methodically, searching for answers that seemed just out of reach. Emma's mind raced, replaying the events that led her to this moment. There was something she knew, something that couldn't stay hidden any longer. The tension was palpable, the air thick with unanswered questions. What secrets were being uncovered tonight? How was Emma connected to this sudden police presence? As the street remained locked down, the story was far from over. The unresolved tension hung like a heavy fog, leaving everyone on edge and eager for the next chapter to unfold. What would happen next on Maple Street? Only time would tell, but one thing was certain: the night was just beginning, and the true story was yet to be revealed. The quiet hum of the police radios blended with the faint whispers of curious neighbors. Children pressed their faces against their bedroom windows, while adults stood in doorways, arms crossed, waiting for answers that didn't come. Emma clung tightly to Mr. Jenkins' arm, her face streaked with tears and fear. He knelt beside her, his voice low and steady. "Emma, can you tell me what's going on?" He asked gently, his grizzled face soft with concern. She shook her head, her lips trembling. "It's my fault," she whispered, barely audible. The weight of those words hung in the air. Mr. Jenkins didn't push her. He could see she was carrying something heavy, something she wasn't ready to say. Behind them, the officers moved with purpose, combing through the street. A detective stepped out of an unmarked car, his coat flapping in the cool breeze. He exchanged a few sharp words with one of the officers before his eyes landed on Emma. "Is this the girl?" the detective asked, his voice firm but not unkind. Mr. Jenkins nodded. "She ran to me crying, said something was her fault. But I don't know more than that." The detective crouched down, meeting Emma's wide, frightened eyes. "Hi, Emma. My name's Detective Harris. I'm here to help, okay? Can you tell me why you're so upset? Anything at all might help us figure out what's going on." Emma hesitated, glancing over her shoulder toward her house. The warm light from the living room spilled out onto the lawn, but it felt miles away. She swallowed hard. "There was a man," she said finally, her voice shaking. "He was outside my house, watching us." Detective Harris exchanged a look with the officer beside him. "When did you see him?" "Earlier." "After school," Emma replied, her words tumbling out now. "He was standing across the street, just staring. I thought he was just a stranger walking by, but he didn't leave. He was still there when it got dark." "Did he do anything else? Say anything?" Emma's face crumpled, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. He knocked on the door when Mom wasn't home. I didn't answer, but he wouldn't go away. He kept knocking and knocking. I was so scared, I hid under the table until he left. Mr. Jenkins squeezed her hand, his own expression darkening. "Why didn't you call someone, Emma?" "Your mom." "The police." "I tried," she said through sobs. "But the phone stopped working. I couldn't get it to work. Then when I looked outside again, he was gone. But I felt like he was still watching." Detective Harris stood, his face unreadable. "Did you notice anything unusual before the phone stopped working? Anything that might help us identify him?" Emma nodded slowly. "I think he cut the wires. I heard something snapping outside, and when I looked out the back window, I saw him near the side of the house." The tension tightened, a nearly audible hum in the air. Detective Harris straightened, his demeanor shifting to one of urgency. "I want a team to check the phone lines and canvass the area. This could escalate quickly." As officers moved to action, Mr. Jenkins stayed close to Emma. "You were brave to come out and tell me," he said softly. "You did the right thing." But Emma didn't feel brave. Her heart pounded as she replayed the moment she saw the man's face. There was something unnervingly cold about his eyes, something she couldn't forget. Meanwhile, across the street, another neighbor emerged cautiously from her home. Mrs. Callahan, an elderly widow who rarely ventured outside, waved timidly to an officer. "Excuse me," she called, her voice frail. "I think I might have seen something too." The officer approached, taking notes as Mrs. Callahan spoke. "There was a man, tall, wearing a dark jacket. I saw him walking up and down the street yesterday. It didn't seem right, the way he kept looking at the houses. He didn't belong here." The puzzle pieces were coming together, but they painted a picture no one wanted to see. Who was this man? Why was he targeting this quiet, unassuming street? Back near the garbage truck, Emma tugged on Detective Harris's sleeve. "There's one more thing," she whispered. "What is it, Emma?" "He had something in his hand," she said, her voice barely audible. "It looked like a knife." Detective Harris froze, the weight of her words settling over him. "Stay here," he ordered, motioning for backup. The quiet street was now a hive of activity. Officers swept the area with flashlights, calling out as they searched for signs of the mysterious intruder. The neighbors, once spectators, now felt the gnawing fear creeping into their homes. And then, from the far end of the block, came a shout. "Over here! I found something!" Emma's breath caught in her throat as she and Mr. Jenkins turned toward the commotion. Detective Harris broke into a sprint, his coat flaring behind him. The tension reached its breaking point. What they found would change everything. Detective Harris reached the far end of the block, where a group of officers was gathered around something in the bushes. Flashlights illuminated the scene, casting sharp shadows that made the discovery even more unsettling. As Harris pushed through the crowd, his eyes landed on the object, a backpack, partially hidden beneath the shrubbery. Inside, they found a collection of items that sent a chill through everyone present. A pair of gloves, a roll of duct tape, and a crumpled piece of paper with a hastily sketched map of the neighborhood. On the map, one house was marked with a red X. It was Emma's house. The realization hit like a thunderclap. This wasn't random. Whoever the man was, he had been planning something. The officers worked quickly, dusting the bag for prints and expanding their search. Harris returned to Emma, his expression grim but determined. "Emma, you're safe now," he said firmly. "We'll find him. But I need you to stay strong, okay?" Emma nodded, clutching Mr. Jenkins' arm. She wanted to believe him, but the fear still clung to her like a shadow. Minutes later, a crackling voice came over the radio. "We've got movement near the park, about 2 blocks north." Matches the description. Harris didn't hesitate. "Let's go." The officers converged on the park, their flashlights slicing through the darkness. The trees loomed overhead, their branches creaking in the night wind. Suddenly, a figure darted between the shadows. "Stop, police!" Harris shouted, his voice echoing through the park. The man didn't stop. He ran deeper into the trees, but the officers were faster. They surrounded him within moments, their voices firm and commanding. The man hesitated, his chest heaving, before finally dropping to his knees. When they brought him back to the street, Emma's blood ran cold. It was him, the man she had seen outside her house. His face was twisted into a scowl, but there was no mistaking the coldness in his eyes. Detective Harris approached Emma carefully. "You don't have to worry about him anymore," he said. "He won't hurt you or anyone else." The police searched the man and found more disturbing items: a second knife and another set of gloves. His intentions were clear now, and the weight of what could have happened settled heavily over everyone. As the officers led him away, the neighbors gathered closer, murmuring in relief and disbelief. Mrs. Callahan, who had been standing quietly nearby, placed a comforting hand on Emma's shoulder. "You're a brave girl," she said softly. "You did the right thing." Emma looked up at her, the warmth of the older woman's words cutting through the lingering fear. As the night wore on, the street slowly returned to its usual quiet. The flashing lights faded, the officers packed up their equipment, and the neighbors retreated back into their homes. Mr. Jenkins stayed with Emma until her mother arrived, rushing to her daughter with tears in her eyes. "I'm so proud of you," her mother said, holding Emma tightly. For the first time that night, Emma felt a sense of safety wash over her. She had faced something terrifying, but she hadn't faced it alone. The following day, the story spread throughout the community. People spoke about Emma's courage, the quick response of the police, and the eerie reminder of how even the safest places could hold unexpected dangers. But they also talked about the kindness of a garbage man who had been there when it mattered most in a neighborhood that came together in a moment of crisis. As Emma sat on her front porch that morning, the sun rising over the now peaceful street, she realized something important. Fear could be overwhelming, but courage wasn't about not being afraid. It was about acting in spite of it. And that made all the difference.